All right, we are continuing, we finished our notes on the Song of Solomon last Wednesday, so we're going to be moving on to the text here in just a minute. It was pretty funny after last Wednesday night. We got home, my father-in-law he said it was kind of awkward. I just kind of laughed at him because I told him, I said, well, how about you come next Wednesday night and you teach the class? Since my voice is all messed up, it was messed up then. And no. He didn't want anything to do with that, but it was pretty funny to rag him about it afterwards. So I did want to mention as we get started that a lot of the text of the Song of Solomon, there's a lot of imagery being used. It's not allegorical, that like it represents some completely other relationship or different people, like the attachment to Christ in the church or that sort of thing. Certainly there are incidental parallels, I guess you could make, to certain elements of Christ in the church, that sort of thing. Certainly not to the extent of the eros nature of the Song of Solomon. But I do want to point out that if you happen to read any commentaries, or if you happen to go through a study guide or something of the Song of Solomon, you're more than likely going to get more than one or two different varying thoughts on, first of all, on the interpretation of it, as we talked about last Wednesday, okay? Whether it's two people, Solomon and his love, and then the chorus of friends. Some people, we talked about the three people concept, which I don't agree with, that it's Solomon, he's trying to steal this Shulamite girl away from her husband or her love or whatever. And then you're going to get varying thoughts also on some of the actual poetic terms being used. Before we get started, I did want to read this because I found this kind of interesting. I don't know, I don't really put a lot of stock in this, but I mean, this is from the Bible commentaries from Zur, and I agree with most of what Zur says. I mean, there's some things, any commentary is going to have some things you're like, I don't know about that. But it's kind of weird to me. I had not read that, I hadn't caught this before. He says, this book describes conversations and visits between Solomon and his favorite wife, the daughter of Pharaoh. And then he has a reference, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. Nothing in the text suggests that this woman is his favorite wife, or for that matter, that there's any connection to her and the Song of Solomon. But what it says is Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, married Pharaoh's daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. And that's it. We see in verse 3, the focus is on Solomon serving God and everything he did after that. There's no coming back to this lady. So whether that's accurate, I imagine the reason Zur inferred this is because there are references to Pharaoh and there's references to Egypt in the Song of Solomon. But that's, again, a lot of the places in which these terms are used aren't being used in a literal way. Like she's going to describe her skin as the tents of Kedar. Okay, it's being used in a kind of a reference. It's not being used literally to say she was from Kedar. So again, if you see stuff like this, it's just some man's thoughts. Okay, I tend to stick with just what we read. Leave speculation where it needs to be. The other thing I wanted to read from Zur was the probability that, so the associations could have been supposed or actual as both as far as their nature is concerned. The probability is that Solomon really put the words into the mouth of his beloved wife to represent what he believed should at least have been her own sentiments, which is to say Solomon wrote it about her, okay, and about what her love was for him and what his love is for her, and that while he's kind of representing her feelings towards him by writing them out. Not that she literally said them necessarily, she may have, but that's what Zur's saying. I wanted to read, At any rate, whether Solomon actually had such experiences or if the wish was father to the thought, he enlarges on the subject and puts it down in his writing to give the reader a view of the love that should exist between a man and his wife. If the reader will keep this in view, he will not be confused as to the propriety of the intimate expressions made between the two parties, as a guide in properly classifying each part of the various conversations between the husband and wife, and then he lays out how to read the Song of Solomon from the perspective of whose part is singing what. Is it the man singing, the woman singing, the chorus singing, and that sort of thing. So I did want to mention that, primarily because he brought up the fact of the Egyptian wife, and also he put into words kind of describing the thought process of Solomon in writing some of this. I also have, and this is actually, it's a really good commentary, really kind of focused on OTP. It's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon by Dwayne Garrett. It's the New American Commentary. And this is my book from Florida College. So it survived. But it's actually an interesting read. I don't necessarily buy in to some of the interpretation of the imagery. Okay, we talked in my notes on last Wednesday. Take it for what it is. You know, I'm not a scholar in ancient poetry, okay? So there may be some references that do have some kind of a deeper meaning or deeper imagery if we had, you know, a deep understanding of ancient poetry. But I did want to mention this from what he says in his introduction. He says, the verse is the title. The song actually begins in verse 2. I'll go ahead and switch over there while we're talking about it. And you see the title, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Keep in mind that the italics are put in by man. So when it says the Shulamite, okay, that's not actually, Solomon didn't write that. Man wrote that because he's understanding the woman is speaking here in verse 2. Okay, and this is the Shulamite girl. So the verse is the title. The song actually begins in verse 2. Unlike the superscripts to many psalms, this verse makes no attempt to tie the song to any event or person in Solomon's life necessarily. From this, one might infer that the Israelites had no tradition linking the song to any specific historical episode, as in whether these words were actually spoken by the Shulamite girl or Solomon's putting them, just kind of like Zur said, whether he's kind of putting them in the mouth of his love. Either way. In the song that follows, only 3 singing parts are evident: a male, a female, and a female chorus. I tend to look at it as a male and female chorus because there's certain things that are said that can go either way, but he looks at it from the female chorus perspective. It doesn't matter. While one could hypothesize that there are more than these 3 parts, such a hypothesis is supported by little, if any, information in the text itself. That's describing the 3-party where we talked about Solomon, the Shulamite girl, and then her love that Solomon steals her away from whom he steals her away, whatever. There was something else I wanted to read here. Okay, at times it is difficult to tell who is singing a given line or strophe of lyrics because the Hebrew text does not delineate the different parts. And that's what I was pointing out here, where it describes the daughters of Jerusalem, the Shulamite, then here later the Shulamite, then they have the beloved speaking. That's put in by man based on his inference of what's being said. The Hebrew doesn't bear that out. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that we need to make sure we pay attention to the text and not necessarily what man put in. Usually, however, it is self-evident from the gender of the pronouns used and other explicit details. Let's see. So this song, the Song of Solomon, they convey the sense that these are parts of a song and not characters in a play or a story. Remember, that was one of the interpretations we talked about, that it's some kind of a dramatic drama, a work of theater, and that's not the case. And that's something that this fellow points out too, that this is not some play or a story. This is a song. One cannot understand the song if one does not recognize that it is lyric poetry and not drama. Okay, so before we get started in the text, and if you happen to have this commentary, read it, whatever. Garrett, he takes and one of the things that I'm going to leave this up here because I want to be able to share some of the stuff that he writes in here with you. He takes a deeper imagery, love imagery, into many of the words that are being written than I would. Okay, I tend to look at it a little bit more literally in some areas rather than in others. To him, a lot of what is said here is symbolic regarding the specific love that's being shared. Could be, if that's some kind of a poetic way of doing that, that could be. But there's also certain things, and I'll point out these as we go, there's certain things that I think could also very well be literal, not necessarily figurative. That's not symbolic, figurative. All right, so before we get started in the text, and really chapter 1, there's not a whole lot explicit language used in chapter 1. That kind of starts in chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, but fair warning, there is some explicit nature of this. Please keep in mind that this is between a husband and a wife. This is not in any way sinful on Solomon's part or inappropriate. Okay? And as Christians, we should not only understand this type of love between a husband and a wife, but appreciate it. Okay? And it's not, again, our Western culture kind of has taught us to be more taboo towards this type of thing. And again, within its context, within the proper relationship, within the proper setting, these are not something that is taboo. Okay? If this were a full class with everybody and kids here, I don't think that would be appropriate. Okay? But with adults, I think this is perfectly appropriate for us to study this. Any thoughts before we actually get started in the actual verses? All right, chapter 1. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. I'm not going to read the headings necessarily. You'll kind of see as we go how it flows. So, the Shulamite. And the reason why this little thing is here, it's not because it's in the text, but my little digital Bible thing is kind of giving us background on what that term Shulamite is when it's being used in the text. It's a Palestinian young woman. The speaker and audience are identified according to the number, gender, and person of the Hebrew words. Occasionally, the identity is not certain. And so when we say Shulamite, she is a woman from Palestine. That doesn't speak to her nationality. Was she Egyptian? Where was she from? It simply speaks to the region where she was from. So she speaks regarding her beloved. And you're going to see, especially here in chapter 1, chapter 2, and going forward, you're not going to see it as much. But we're going to see these little italics right here. These pronouns that are being used in the Hebrew are specifically being used to address the individual to whom she's, to describe the individual to whom she's addressing. Anyway, like when she says, your love is better than wine, it's in the masculine singular. So that's being focused towards her love, which is what she refers to as her beloved. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Because of the fragrance of your good ointments, your name is ointment poured forth. Therefore the virgins love you. Draw me away. And then verse 4 here in the middle part, we have what sounds like the chorus speaking up. We will run after you. And that we, when you have that plurality, that's the chorus speaking. And of course, she just referenced them. The virgins love you. And these are the daughters of Jerusalem speaking. We will run after you. So these first 3 verses, really, she describes how that she's longing for that affection. She loves that affection from her beloved. And this is one example like verse 2. For your love is better than wine. Garrett interprets this as the actual act of love making, because that's the expression of the love. Whether or not that's the case, that could be, that wouldn't certainly be out of place in the context of the Song of Solomon. But I don't have any problem looking at it more abstract either. Okay, because love is not necessarily just a specific act of love. Love is more of an intangible. Love is a consistent character. And so I don't see any reason. She's talking about the kisses of his mouth. I get it, but the way he treats her, the way he cares for her, in love making or outside of it, she says, is better than wine. Because of the fragrance of your good ointments, your name is ointment poured forth. Therefore, the virgins love you. This ointment that she keeps talking about and the fragrance of it, it describes these, and in ancient times, both the men and the women used perfume. Okay, we guys call it, what do we call it today? We don't call it perfume. What do we call it? Cologne. I don't wear cologne. Cologne. Okay, and the nature of these fragrances and ointments speak to the wealth, really, of Solomon, as we were describing. Okay, the quality of them, And not only that, but how he presents himself is kind of being described. Not just the literal fragrance, but how he's presenting himself. Okay, and all the virgins of Jerusalem love him. Whether that speaks to Solomon's looks, I think it probably speaks to more than that. I don't necessarily think they were all that shallow then. I think it speaks more to his character, how he carried himself, his stature, and of course the fact that he was king, and the fact that he had the wealth to be able to provide these things for himself. And she calls on him to draw her away, to take her away. And then the daughters of Jerusalem say, "We will run after you." So the Shulamite comes in and says, "The king has brought me into his chambers." And then the daughters of Jerusalem speak, "We will be glad and rejoice in you. We will remember your love more than wine." So again, and I'm going to reference a couple times what Garrett has to say about some of this stuff. When he says the king has brought me into his chambers, he thinks that this is love language. That this isn't a literal king. He's not saying it's not Solomon. It is Solomon. But that she's not necessarily referencing Solomon as the king, but rather she's his queen. And he is her king in this relationship that they have together. Maybe so. Okay, that might be. I don't see anything wrong with referring to this as Solomon, because he's king. Okay, the king has brought me into his chambers. This is the bedroom where she's describing, old style way of saying bedrooms, chambers. And then the daughters of Jerusalem, and this is why I feel the way I do back up in verse 2 about their love and how Garrett referred to it as the act of lovemaking. Notice how the daughters of Jerusalem say, "We will be glad and rejoice in you." And this one specifically is speaking about the Shulamite girl. And then "we will remember your love more than wine." Notice how, though, it changes here at this last one. This is the beloved. So I tend to think, they're talking about that love. I tend not to think that that's some kind of act of lovemaking that they're able to see. I don't think that's appropriate. I think, again, they're referring to the love of Solomon for the Shulamite woman. So as a result, both in verse 2 and here, I tend to look at this as their great love for each other, their affection for one another, their care for one another, not so much just an act. Okay? So any thoughts so far through this? Yes, sir.
Like when we see a young couple falling in love, we say you can see it in their disposition.
Yep.
So I think that's similar.
Yeah, that is not something not specific. Yeah, I think it's more generic, more intangible reference here. So then the Shulamite girl comes back in to say, "Rightly do they." So there's the plural. Again, there's only three parties in this entire thing. There's the chorus. There's the chorus of the daughters of Jerusalem. These are the virgins that were described. Then there's the Shulamite girl, and then Solomon. And at certain places, there might also be a chorus of men speaking, and we'll get when we talk about that. But I kind of consider them all one part as the others, they. All right. So she says, "Rightly do they love you." That's about the beloved. And again, that little italics, the Hebrew pronoun there is a masculine pronoun. So that's the only other fellow mentioned in the Song of Solomon. Verse 5, "I am dark but lovely." So this is the girl speaking. "O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon." So she describes her physical appearance and the fact that she's dark but lovely. And there's a contrast being used here, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Like the tents of Kedar. Okay, and the tents of Kedar, the way the commentaries describe what she's describing, that they're darkened because of the weather that they're in, because of the area that Kedar is in. That there's a lot of sun. There's not a whole lot of bad weather that kind of dulls everything. It's kind of the sun just beats down on everything, and like the curtains of Solomon. So you see, she's dark like the tents of Kedar, but she's lovely like the curtains of Solomon. The curtains of Solomon would have been majestic. They would have been overflowing with beauty. Okay, and that's how she describes. And she's not bragging. That's just how she describes herself. "Do not look upon me because I am dark, because the sun has tanned me. Verse 6, my mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. So this particular point, and I do want to read what Garrett has to say here because he puts it in great language here about the fact that she's bringing out that she's dark. She says, he says, the woman is embarrassed and defensive about her dark skin. In contrast to modern standards of beauty, the ancients in Israel regarded light skin as most attractive. Dark skin identified her as of the laboring class and left her vulnerable to scorn. That, as Fox notes, Fox is one of the commentators that he references, would originate in social, not racial prejudices. So it's not because she's dark-skinned, but it speaks to what her status in their society is, that she's a laborer. And I find it interesting because when you read Zur and his commentary, he mentions the fact that, to explain this, because he thinks that this is Pharaoh's daughter, so she's a princess. In no way could she be a laborer. But he tends to think that she was constantly working for the rest of the family. Okay, maybe. But I tend to agree with Garrett that this explains it much more, especially given the text as it goes forward. It's almost as if Solomon found a diamond in the rough, so to speak. Okay, here's this beautiful woman in the midst of a working class. And she's lovely, she's beautiful, and he just kind of, he happened to come across her. And and she even refers to verse 6, that my mother's sons, her brothers, were angry with me, so they made me the keeper of the vineyards. So she's working and toiling in their vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Well, she doesn't have a vineyard. She's referring to herself. Okay? That's why the dark but lovely, she's not light-skinned because she's had to work. She hasn't been able to take care of herself, as perhaps other women in higher class may have been able to do. She had to work. And that's why she's explaining that. Any thoughts through verse 6? All right. So if nobody says anything, I assume I'm explaining it well. Okay? If you're confused, please stop and say something. Don't be embarrassed to say something or ask something, because I want to make sure I'm trying to keep track of everything that we're doing, because this is kind of a complicated study, not only in the explicit nature of it, but also in the different parts being delineated and the different thoughts being described and so forth. So just kind of, if you're confused or lost, just let me know. Verse 7. So, again, these masculine versus feminine pronouns being used in the Hebrew helps us to kind of keep track where she's directing her language or her dialogue. So verse 7, tell me, O whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon. For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions? So this is where a lot of people get the idea of the three-party interpretation. Okay? Because, and they look at this literally, verse 7, and they think, well, obviously she's talking about a shepherd. Solomon wasn't a shepherd. He was actually the exact opposite of a shepherd from a society status point of view. So, and then later she's going to refer to how Solomon is taking her away. Verse, where is it? It must be in chapter 2. But she refers to the fact that Solomon has come and is taking her to her bedchambers, or to his bedchambers. And the interpretation there is, well, he's stealing her away from her shepherd love. I think she's referring to Solomon here. Okay, but what she's referring to, I think it's interesting that she refers to him as a shepherd. Okay, Garrett has, again, this is more, he looks at this as love language. Okay, that it's just a way to express her deep affection for him. I tend to look at it a little bit more, he's the one that takes care of her. Okay? He is her shepherd. He is the one that shepherds all of Israel, for that matter. Okay? The king is basically like a shepherd for all of the people of Israel. And so, but when she describes this, where do you feed your flock? Where do you make it rest at noon? For why should I be as one? So she's asking her beloved, and keep in mind, Solomon had many, many wives. Okay, so he couldn't spend all the time with just one of them. Okay, so but she's wanting to find Solomon. Where can I find you? Is what she's asking. So in the analogy of him as a shepherd, she's going with that thought process and describing it the way she does. Why should I be as one who veils herself? This is also interpreted as one who wanders, because when women would leave their home, they wore veils, and different veils depicted different states of their relationship. There was a certain veil for a married woman, there was a certain veil for an unmarried woman, there was even a certain veil for a harlot. So different types of attire showed different statuses, different relationship situations. And so if that's why she's saying, why should I be as one who veils herself? I want to come to you, but if I have to go around looking for you, I have to go around asking people, where are you? And so then the beloved responds here in verse 8, if you do not know, O fairest among women, follow in the footsteps of the flock, and feed your little goats beside the shepherd's tents. I have compared you, my love, to my filly among Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with chains of gold. In essence, the response of the beloved in Solomon, you know where to find me. Okay, you know where to find me, is his response. If you do not know, O fairest among women. Okay, so he's referring to her as the prettiest of them all. Okay, out of all of the wives and concubines apparently that he had, she's the prettiest, the fairest, the most lovely, as far as he's concerned. Again, the scriptures don't bear out any specific one. I think Zer's he's kind of inferring from language referencing Pharaoh's chariots, for instance, and so forth, that this is that daughter of Pharaoh, but there's no scriptural connection to that. That's just a thought. Okay? Follow in the footsteps of the flock. You know where to find me. Okay? You know where to find me. Feed your little goats beside the shepherd's tents. It's again, he's going along with the analogy that she started, and you know where to find me. Yeah, there is love language, the idea of love analogy type thing here, but it's just the idea of, I want to find you. I want to be with you. And he says, you know where to find me. Verse 9, I have compared you, my love, to my filly among Pharaoh's chariots. Garrett, this is actually kind of comical how Garrett explains this here. I thought this was kind of neat. So he's talking about the horse analogy. The man is at the same time this rustic shepherd that's being described, and yet able to give his beloved gold jewelry. Again, however, and I do take it literally, he says this is not to be pressed literally. Both the pastoral language and the mention of fine jewelry heighten the sense of joy in love. The former conveys the image of that which is natural, and the latter makes the impression that love is of great value and adorns the woman. Could be. That could be. I mean, he's taking a much deeper poetic look at it by saying that the pastoral nature of the shepherd and the flock, there's kind of this natural beauty of their love, but then the ornaments and the gold is that love is of great value and adorns her. Okay, it could be. I tend to look at it more literally. I think that she was literally being given this jewelry by Solomon. He was adorning her with it. I don't think the shepherd part is necessarily literal, because Solomon wasn't a literal shepherd, but the analogy to that. And then he says, the language is far removed from modern Western poetry and thus may confuse the modern reader. He is not saying she looks like a horse. The horses that drew the Pharaoh's chariots were heavily decorated with ornaments and embroidery. The impression conveyed is one of great beauty combined with regal dignity, and it is this that he ascribes to the woman. I completely agree with that. I just don't like I don't think it's necessary to apply the fact that it's figurative, that it just means that the love is so beautiful. I think it's literal ornaments because he's comparing her to one of Pharaoh's horses because of the regal, beautiful nature of that which she's adorned with, because Solomon's able to give it to her. All right, anything through verse 10?
Well, I think if you go back to Joe's comment about people falling in love, and you look back in verse 8, verse 7, where it says, the old King James leaves out thy flock, where it's
Yeah, that's italicized. Yep.
So if you just read that, it's like saying, are you going to be where you normally are for lunch, and are you going to take your rest at your normal place? If we were going to say that today, and why should I have to hide myself? Are you going to be surrounded by all your friends?
Yeah. Yep.
And so then if you go back down, he's like, well, I'm going to be looking out for you anyway. And
Yeah.
Put it in the context that Joe said, two people falling in love.
Right.
I'm going to be looking for you.
Right.
So just take your sheep and feed them by the tent, and
Yeah.
I'm going to be looking for you, and I'm going to look at your beauty, and you're going to find me, and so it's interesting, if you take out the italicized words, sometimes it becomes a little bit easier
Yeah.
to understand.
Yeah. And of course, those italicized words they're put there for the analogy's sake, I think.
Right.
But like you said, that can lead more confusion than just interpreting what it's saying, in our modern idea or modern way of thinking, as opposed to shepherds and so forth. Anything else through verse 10?
I think of Esther and her relationship to that king.
Yeah.
How, he was a loner.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that was just him or if that was characteristic of many kings during that period of time. And you don't dare, go in there where maybe she's just testing the waters. Is it okay to spend time with you, type thing?
Yeah.
And his response is, sure is.
Yeah.
Sure is fine.
Yeah.
And that's communication
Sure.
between a husband and wife or anyone to.
What are the expectations?
How
Yep.
do you feel about, whether we can spend time?
Yeah.
Do you have time with all your other duties? And he is king.
Yeah.
He does have
A lot.
full-time job,
Yep.
I'd say. So, but you make time whenever it's your wife
Yeah.
or your relationship. You make time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just a communication of them, how we can communicate
Sure.
with our spouses.
Sure. Yeah. Good point. Yes, sir.
I kind of look at it like, as far as Solomon being the shepherd or whatever, it's talking about the virgins and the daughters of Jerusalem. You're going to have this group of women that, the concubines and everything, the wives of Solomon, and he takes care of them. Well, then you look at it from the other part where it talks about if you follow the rest of them, you'll find me. That kind of ties.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought about that, Ben. I hadn't thought about that. That as opposed to that the daughters of Jerusalem and the virgins could be a reference not necessarily to just the women of Jerusalem in general, but the specific wives and concubines of Solomon, who also are trying to go after. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I haven't even read that in any of the commentaries either. That's a great point. And that really does. It fits. That fits. Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts through verse 10? All right. So, verse 11, the daughters of Jerusalem. I'm going to go with Ben's thought on this. From this point forward, unless I find something that kind of goes against it, I'm going to kind of agree with Ben on this. The other, perhaps, ladies, okay, who also, they're observing the relationship between Solomon, or, again, I'm saying this as if this is them literally speaking. Solomon's writing this, okay? Whether Solomon would be able to observe the jealousy between these other wives or concubines and the Shulamite girl, it may not have existed, but I can only imagine that it might have if Solomon spent more time with this woman than any others. Oh, you would think. He would think.
The wisest man.
You would think. But, so there's no reference to that jealousy or anything like that there. So, if these daughters of Jerusalem, if they really are his wives and concubines and they're happy for them or whatever, I don't know. Anyway, they say, we will make you ornaments of gold with studs of silver. They're speaking to the girl in this. When I say the girl, the Shulamite girl, that's the feminine. We will make you ornaments of gold with studs of silver. The recognition that she has these things to be able to wear to show that regal nature. Now, not only that, but the fact that this is how Solomon views her, with being so lovely and so beautiful to him. Verse 12, while the king is at his table, and again, Garrett says this is love language. It's not necessarily to be taken literally as the king. I disagree. I think she's talking about the king because he's the king. While the king is at his table, my spikenard sends forth its fragrance. A bundle of myrrh is my beloved to me that lies all night between my breasts. my beloved, is to me a cluster of henna blooms in the vineyards of En-gedi. So she's describing the king and the fact that she's trying to get him to notice her, get him to spend time with her. And again, just as Doug said, it's not that he's not wanting to, but she's trying to get his attention. This idea of a bundle of myrrh is my beloved to me. Of course, myrrh was a very valuable commodity, very expensive. Remember what the 3 gifts to Jesus when he was a baby by the wise men? Not the 3 wise men, just the wise men were gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay, all 3 of those were very expensive, very sought after commodities. Myrrh certainly is just as valuable in Solomon's time as it is in Jesus' time. And so this idea of lying between her breasts, it's the idea of her kind of encompassing him. I don't necessarily think that there's any sexual element to this in verse 13 per se. It's just the idea of her embracing him, holding him while they sleep at night. Okay, that's the idea, and how much she clings to him. Okay, just as you would if you had something valuable and you didn't want to lose it. It's so valuable to you. That's what the king is to her. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blooms in the vineyards of En-gedi. The commentaries describe this as one of those other commodities that's so valuable, so expensive, so highly sought after. That's what her beloved, that's what Solomon is to her. Okay, so Garrett takes a much more sexual reading of this, verses 12 through 14. Again, that may be, but there's plenty of other sexual references in the Song of Solomon without interpreting it from other things too. Okay, so I just tend to think that right now we're kind of building up. This is describing the character of their love before they start getting into the specifics of their love. And Garrett kind of takes a more figurative approach, let's say. Any thoughts through verse 14? All right. Verse 15. O beloved speaks again. And again, you can kind of tell, even if we didn't have these italics here, you can kind of tell who's saying what based on the context. Behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair, you have dove's eyes. Generally, you didn't describe men as being fair and having dove's eyes. And again, those pronouns, you are fair, you have dove's eyes, again, that feminine is being described. In fact, after chapter 1, whoever put my digital Bible together doesn't bother putting the italics there anymore because the point's been made. All right, there's different pronouns being used to describe these different characters. So you have, behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair. You have dove's eyes, describing that's the beauty of her eyes that he's describing. And then the girl responds, behold, you are handsome, my beloved. Yes, pleasant. Also, our bed is green. The beams of our houses are cedar, and our rafters of fir. So I don't know what a shepherd would make back in those days, but I don't think they had houses, plural. That was something I picked up on, the beams of our houses. I would think that a shepherd might have a shack, a hut, maybe. I don't know. I don't know how much they made. Maybe they made more than that. But she's talking about Solomon. He certainly had houses for miles, okay? She's describing his beauty, describing their bed being green. I read some commentaries on that, and it describes how back in that day and age, having real trees and wood and greenery, like covering the bed tent type of thing, the bed covering, what is that called? Is there a word for that?
Canopy.
Canopy, thank you. The canopy, that was a sign of luxury, it was a sign of great love, it was symbolic. And that's kind of what's being described. Our bed is green, the beams of our houses are cedar, rafters of fir, great wealth, great being taken care of. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, so for an outside girl, that just means we're sleeping outside. The beams of our house are cedar. I'm sleeping under a cedar tree and I have a fir tree over me.
Oh, you know what? And I hadn't thought about that.
I'm sleeping on the grass.
Yeah.
With trees around me. That's what it means to an outside girl.
That fits, though. I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting. But I don't think they're literally doing that, but I get it. Yep. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments. We'll pick up chapter 2 next Wednesday night.